youth and even younger who are serving as crew leaders. So I want to give, I know Ashley kind of thanked you guys. I want to give my official pastoral thank you. So you can feel so honored by that. And then I just want to say, I know today we've got a lot of people who are visiting us, perhaps people whose kids came to day camp, and so you're here this morning, your kids dragged you here, and you're just in it for the food afterwards. But we're happy that you're here, and I want to offer you my official pastoral welcome. So there's a lot of official pleasantries going around here. Now, if there were, if you were to come up with a list of things that you probably should not talk about if there was like a Sunday with like a lot of visitors, religious zeal would probably be near the top of that. So that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about zeal, and partly because we're going to talk especially about youthful zeal, or at least that's going to be one of the emphases here. And of course, this week is one where we saw so much life in our kids and in our youth and so on. It's also kind of where we're at in the series that we're in. But I want to say to you who are, you preteens, you teenagers, even you 20-somethings, I want to tell you something. I want to tell you that the world needs you to be zealous. The world needs you to be zealous disciples of Jesus. The church needs you to be on fire, passionate, all in followers of Jesus. And I'll tell you why at the very end of the sermon. But I want to say that right at the beginning. The world needs you to be zealous. And I used to think that zeal, passion, that this was something that kind of came with the territory of being young, that it was just like an inevitable feature of youthfulness, and I'm not so sure it is actually. And I don't think it is because we grow up, we live in a world where there are so many options, so many choices, that we seem to have become commitment phobic. We can't commit to anything. We can't go all in on anything. And so all your event invites will be like half of them will be maybes, right? And you don't know if the plans you made are actually going to stick until the person actually shows up at your door, because we live in this world where you're always holding out for something better. You're always hedging your bets. We live in a world where we're taught to be passive consumers, where just all the content is fed to you where you are, where you don't even have to go out and go shopping. You just one click and Amazon will bring it to your door. What they really want to do is bring it in through your door, put it on your lap for you. I mean, we live in this world where people are just walking around and it's like we're numb because everybody's just passively taking in content on their phones. I think so much of our modern world actually fosters in us complacency and apathy rather than passion and zeal. And for you, next generation, I'm not blaming you. I'm not saying it's your fault. This is the world that you've been raised in. In some ways, this is just the default mode of being. You don't have to choose. This is just the way it is. But what I'm encouraging you, what I'm exhorting you today, is to choose to say no to that. To choose to become passionate, to become zealous, to step away from that complacency, because the world needs it. I mean, the truth is, I'm talking to everybody, of course. I'm going to encourage all of you to be passionate, to be zealous, particularly about the gospel. But I'm speaking especially to the younger people here because, as one person has said it, you often need the kindling to light the old logs on fire. And if you're offended because I just called you an old log, it wasn't me, it was some anonymous person on the internet. So you can talk to them, you can talk to Anonymous. But oftentimes, like in the great movements of God throughout history, in the revival moments, it's been led by people in their teens, in their 20s. Us 30-somethings, we're over the hill already. So hopefully not. But it really has often been the younger ones who grab a hold of this first. So be zealous. And I want to tell you this morning about a man in the Bible who was zealous. His name was Josiah. He was the king of Judah, About 26 to 2,700 years ago, little region in the Middle East in what is modern-day Israel. He was the king of that area, and this is what we read in 2 Chronicles 34. If you don't have a Bible with you, don't worry about it. It's okay. It's on the screen behind me. 2 Chronicles 34, Josiah was 8 years old when he became king. Can you imagine? 8 years old. He would have had regents, tutors, mentors, kind of helping him make the decisions, of course, but he's got the throne at 8. He reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and followed the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. You know, that statement right there. A lot of kings, or some kings, are described as following in the footsteps of David. No other king is said to not turn from the right or to the left. Josiah was a really, really good king who was really faithful, did what was right. In the 8th year of his reign, while he was still young, he began to seek the God of his father David. Let me ask you, he was 8 years old when he became king. In his 8th year, he began to seek the Lord. How old was he when he began to seek the Lord? 16. You guys are math geniuses. Well done. 16 years old, he began to seek the Lord. Now I want you to look at that word, to seek. You see, Josiah did not just give a glance to God. Didn't give him a cursory prayer every now and then. Josiah, for him, it wasn't that God was like the dessert or the side salad, even worse, on the main course of his life. God was the main course. God was who his heart desired. He was hungry. He was thirsty to know God, to follow him. This was the whole orientation, the whole drive in his life, was to know and to honor and to follow God. Are you seeking the Lord? Are you seeking the Lord? And if not, then what are you seeking? One way to get at this would be to ask, if everything in your life had to go except for one thing, what would that one thing be? What would be the one thing you would hold on to if everything else was lost? See, for a lot of us, we've never really sought the Lord. You know, we believe in his existence, perhaps. We say prayers every now and then. We maybe go to church every now and then, but we haven't sought the Lord. What we seek maybe is status and comfort and security and family and romantic love and popularity and all kinds of other things. And then we wonder why we don't experience more of God's presence, why he seems so far away, why our hearts seem to be unchanged, why our lives don't seem to be showing any kind of difference. Leonard Ravenhill, a man who was on fire about 50, 60 years ago, he criticized Christians for wanting big blessings for small installments, for wanting the birth of revival but not the pain of the birth. Are you looking for big blessings from God but only willing to give small installments? He also said that this whole go to church once a week and pay your tithes and sing in the choir Christianity is a farce. Now, we don't have a choir, so you luck out there. But it's a farce if that's the limit of our Christian service and the extent of our passion for souls. It's a farce. You know, the promise of Chronicles is that if you seek the Lord, you will find him. That he will make himself known to you. The chronicler says earlier on, the Lord is with you when you're with him. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you. If you seek him, he will be found by you. This is what Josiah found at age 16. He was seeking the Lord. This was his hunger, his thirst to know God, and he knew him. He found him. And this happened to me when I was 14. Josiah 16, I was 14. You know, just different levels of maturity, that's all. No, when I was 14 years old, I began having all kinds of questions about the existence of God, about the divinity of Jesus, the trustworthiness of the Bible, my own salvation. Everything was up for grabs. And I desperately wanted to know the truth. I desperately sought the Lord in this. I've shared this before, but there were moments where I was on the verge of just giving up faith altogether, and I'm crying out to God. This just consumed me. All I wanted to know was God's presence. And over again in those moments where I felt like I was on the edge of giving up, God just flooded me with his presence, with his love, with his joy, with his peace, all those doubts dissipate, and I was just filled with his Holy Spirit. I was seeking the Lord, and he made himself known to me. Are you seeking the Lord? And again, I say to you of the next generation, don't wait. Don't wait till you're older. Don't say to yourself, well, I'll spend my teenage years pursuing frivolous things, superficial joys, fleeting pleasures, instant gratification that really in the end is just sin. Don't think I'll just do that and then when I'm older I'll get serious about God. Get serious about him now. That's real joy. That's real life. Be zealous. Seek him now. Josiah did that when he was 16 years old. In the 12th year, so became king when he's 8 years old, 12th year, how old is he now? Oh, that's a tougher one, hey? 8 plus 12. 20, okay. Well, 3 of you passed, okay. In the 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of high places, Asherah poles, and idols. Under his direction, the altars of the Baals were torn down. He cut to pieces the incense altars that were above them and smashed the Asherah poles and the idols. These he broke to pieces and scattered over the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. He burned the bones of the priests on the altars, and so he purged Judah and Jerusalem. In the towns of Manasseh, Ephraim, and Simeon, as far as Naphtali, and in the ruins around them, he tore down the altars and the Asherah poles, and crushed the idols to powder, and cut to pieces all the incense altars throughout Israel, and then he went back to Jerusalem. What you have here is just a massive idol-smashing tour. You can imagine in the modern day, this would be Instagrammed, right? Like every stop, you like smashing an idol, and it's like hashtag. I've never hashtagged before, so it'd be something. It'd be hashtag something. And he did this as far as the north. He went all over. Now, the northern area, which was Israel, had been conquered by Assyria. But at this point in history, Assyria, the great superpower at the time, their power was waning. And so the north had become a kind of a wasteland. Similar to the way in which Kawhi Leonard left my beloved Toronto Raptors and has left the north a desolate wasteland for King Giannis of Milwaukee to have free reign in. That's the Raptors reference for the week. So Josiah had this opportunity. It's a wasteland. He has the opportunity to kind of spread this influence over all this land that at one point was Israel. And so he goes throughout the whole place and he just purges it of idolatry. So he's 16 years old. He seeks the Lord. And when he's 20, he becomes a leader, truly becomes a king, and kind of leads his people in getting rid of idolatry. Now, why? Why does his zeal, his seeking the Lord, result in this? You know, the thing about idols, about false gods, is that you usually need more than one. Because they can't do everything for you. They're not almighty. They're not omnipotent, omnipresent, whatever. They're not everything. So you need more than one, right? So in Israel's day, you had this Canaanite god Baal, who many people worshipped, but Baal wasn't enough. So you also had Asherah, and Asherah was Baal's, let's say, bed partner. And you would worship Asherah by putting up sacred poles and trees around Baal's altar. So you would need her because she would give you literal, physical, biological life. She's the goddess of fertility. Baal can't do that. So you need to have a whole bunch. You got to put your eggs in a whole bunch of baskets. It's the same thing with idolatry now. If the thing that you trust in to save you is your work, let's say your status at work, that's going to get you so far, but you're going to need other stuff to kind of fill the other gaps. And so you end up worshiping a bunch of things. The thing about God, the God of the Bible, is that he's almighty. He's the Lord. He's the maker of heaven and earth. There are no other gods. There can't be. If God is God, there cannot be any other God. There's no room for them. And if you're zealous about God and you're putting your trust and your hope in God, then there can't be any room in your life for other gods, for other idols, for other things to worship. If you put your trust in God to save you and give you life, you cannot put your trust in anything else. That's the nature of who God is. And so if you're zealous about God, then that's going to mean that you're going to want to rid your life of all other pretenders, all other false gods, all other idols. Same thing in Josiah's day. You're going to be zealous about this. If you're zealous about God, you're going to want to make sure that no idols can get a grip on your heart. You're going to want to get that stuff out because it's got to be all God. This is what one person says about zealous Christians. His name is Dr. Joel Beek. He says, zealous people only see one thing. They care for one thing. They live for one thing. They're swallowed up in one thing, and that one thing is to please God. Whether they live or whether they die, whether they're healthy or whether they're sick, whether they're rich or whether they're poor, whether they please man or whether they give offense, whether they are thought wise or whether they're thought foolish, whether they are accused, whether they're praised, whether they get honor, whether they get shame. I should have picked a different quote. For all this, the zealous person cares nothing at all. They have a passion for one thing, and that one thing is to please God and to advance God's glory. One thing. Single-minded desire in life. Now, as soon as I say that, as I'm talking about zeal and I'm talking about Josiah's zeal, some of you have got red flags going up. You've got alarm bells going off. You're like, this sounds dangerous. This doesn't sound very balanced. If this is what you guys talk about at the bridge, we're never coming back. But there is a barbecue afterwards, so stick around for that, at least. Listen, here's the question, right? Is there such a thing as bad religious zeal, destructive religious zeal? 100% yes. Yes, there absolutely is. And all you need to do actually is to look at Josiah's family tree to get at that. His grandfather, Manasseh, who was also a king in Judah, this is how he's described. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had demolished. He erected altars to the Baals and made Asherah poles. He bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshipped them. He sacrificed his children in the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom. He practiced divination and witchcraft. He sought omens. He consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. Let me ask you, from that description, would you say that Manasseh was zealous in a religious sense? Yes, absolutely he was. He was incredibly zealous. He was incredibly passionate about religion. That's all he was doing. He was seeking omens and witchcraft and divination. He was so devoted to a certain God, he sacrificed his own children in the fire to them. Manasseh was incredibly zealous. Now, later on in his life, he had a humbling experience. He was led away in exile to Assyria by a hook in his nose. And there he humbled himself. He repented. He called on the Lord, kind of said, that's it, I'm done with all this idolatry. Kind of doesn't lead to very good results. And so in the very last part of his life, it was different. But his son, Josiah's father, Amon, he followed in the first ways of Manasseh. So he was all about idols. He was all about following after these gods too. He was religiously zealous until he was assassinated 2 years into his reign for political and probably religious reasons as well. So this is what Josiah grows up with. He grows up with a grandfather who kills his own children in the name of some god, grows up in the midst of religious turmoil and zeal and passion in all kinds of directions. But here's what I notice. Josiah doesn't look at all that and say, I'm done with zeal. I'm done with passion. You know what? I'm just going to be Mr. Moderate, Mr. Stoic. I'm just going to do away with all of that. Because that's what some people would do, right? You see the results of bad religious zeal and you go, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. And it kind of, like, to be honest, it kind of drives me a little bit crazy when I hear Christians say things like that. When Christians go, I saw people get too passionate and I decided I just kind of like take the pedal off the gas. I'd just be kind of more moderate about it. I mean, like, we don't do that, let's say, I hope that you don't do that with all things in life. You know, the very first time I had sushi. I moved here to the Lower Mainland 12 years ago. Grew up on the prairies, so there's not a whole lot of fresh fish in the middle of Manitoba. So I moved here, and I had my first piece of sushi. And I think I've maybe told this story before, but I had this. I didn't know what wasabi was, but it looked good, and so I had a huge lump of it on my first piece of sushi I ever ate. I stuck it in my mouth. Man, that was something. That, that sensation just shooting through your nose. Wow! But I persisted. I didn't go, well, that's it. Sushi's terrible. I was like, no, there's got to be something good here. And now I know that in eternity, if there's food, it'll be sushi. It'll just be all you can eat sushi in heaven forever and ever because it's God's food. It's got to be. It's so good. You have one bad experience. You don't swear off the whole thing. You got to find the good stuff. That's Josiah. He obviously grew up with a bad experience of religious zeal, but he doesn't do away with it. He says, no, what does it need to look like? And actually, who does it need to be about is really the question. And for Josiah, that zeal had to be directed towards the Lord God Almighty, the one God, creator of all things. Well, here's the next question, though. Some of you will ask, well, isn't it possible for there to be bad religious zeal that is directed to God? Again, I'm with you, 100% yes. Yeah, there is. Paul, in the New Testament, is a great guy to consult with on this. This is what Paul says in Romans. He's talking about his fellow Jews, people who worship God, who had God reveal himself to them. He says, for I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based on knowledge. They're zealous for God. And here's, interestingly, Paul makes a distinction between the zeal for God and zeal for God without knowledge. And Paul knew this firsthand because he was a man who was incredibly zealous for God. This is what he says in Acts. He's preaching to people who are trying to kill him. And he says, look, I was as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way, referring to Jesus. I persecuted them to their death. And then he says in Philippians, he's basically listing off his resume, and he says, as for zeal, I was persecuting the church. I mean, Paul was so zealous for God that like Josiah many, many years before, he was actually going after, physically, violently going after those who were committing blasphemy, because in his view, that's what Christians were doing. Christians were, at that point, mainly Jewish people who were claiming that Jesus was the Son of God and worthy of worship. As a monotheistic Jew, that was incredibly offensive. And so Paul took it upon himself to be zealous for God and stamp this movement out. He was incredibly zealous. And then, one day on the road, one of these turning points in history, he's on the way to Damascus to arrest a bunch of Christians, and Jesus meets him on the road. Bright, blinding light. Jesus asks him, why are you persecuting me? He says, who are you? And Jesus says, I'm Jesus, who you are persecuting. And in that moment, everything changes for Paul. He realizes that his zeal, even though it had been for God, actually was not according to knowledge. And so he turns around. But then here's the interesting thing again about Paul. Paul doesn't go, wow, I was crazy. I was killing people. I was arresting them because of my zeal. I should swear off of zeal. No. Once again, he just says, no, zeal is good. It's got to be the good stuff. So Paul says, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Never. The guy who looked back on his zeal and said, I was the worst of sinners, says, nevertheless, never be lacking in zeal. He says in Galatians, it's fine to be zealous, provided the purpose is good, and to be always be zealous as long as the purpose is good. So again, is there bad religious zeal even directed to God? Yes. But it doesn't mean that we just kind of swear off the whole thing. So then, if I'm interpreting your silence correctly, here's your question now. Your question would be, well then how do you know? How do you tell the difference between the bad stuff and the good stuff? How do you know that your religious zeal is not destructive? For this, I think you got to look at the standard. You got to look at the standard of zeal, and that's often the case, right? If you want to know how you're doing, you got to compare yourself to a certain standard. If you're writing a test, there's like a standard, there's like a model of perfection, and it's like the closer you get to that, the better your test is. What's the standard? What's the model, the perfect model of zeal? It's God. And maybe you haven't thought about that. But God is zealous. Listen to Isaiah chapter 9. We talked about this prophecy last week, actually. These are famous words that we often read at Christmas time. God, through Isaiah, talks about this son who will be born to us, a king, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. Sounds great, right? God is going to make his reign among us. He's going to make all things right. He's going to rule with righteousness. How is it going to happen? The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. How is it going to happen? How is the kingdom of God going to happen? How is this thing that we all long for going to happen? It's going to happen because of the zeal of the Lord, because God is zealous. Now, those words we believe are fulfilled in Jesus. That Jesus is that Son who is born to us, the King who reigns in righteousness, who can be called God, who can be called Counselor, and so on. He is that one. And look at Jesus. Look at his life. He is zealous. Maybe the best example is when he walks into the temple and he sees that these religious leaders are taking advantage of the poor and keeping the outsiders from having a place to worship and pray, and that they've turned the place into a marketplace. And he goes in there and he just starts flipping over tables and driving people out. And his disciples, actually, the Bible tells us that the disciples looked at that and they were reminded about this verse about the zeal for God's house. That this is what characterized Jesus, zeal. And you think about everything that Jesus did. His zeal came out in his teaching, in his commitment to truth, in the depth of his conviction. It came out in his healing, his compassion for outsiders, for sick, the zeal to see them come into wholeness. You see his zeal in his confrontation with demons, in his confrontation with Pharisees. And you see it most of all at the cross. You see the zeal of God in Jesus, in his willingness to undergo unimaginable humiliation, to suffer at the hands of sinners, to be beaten, to be mocked, and to be hung on a cross. The zeal of Jesus is seen in his willingness to go through all of that. His zeal is for you and for me. That's what that was all about. That's what the cross was about saving you and saving me. You see, if Jesus had not been zealous, if he had said, I'm not going to get too worked up, I'm not going to get too passionate about this, he wouldn't have gone anywhere near the cross. If Jesus was half-hearted, if he was lukewarm, we would be stuck in our sins forever. There would be no salvation. It is because of the zeal of Jesus. It is because of his passion to save sinners like you and like me that took him all the way to the cross. His zeal for us to know him, to know his love, to be reconciled to him. If you want to know what zeal is, all you need to do is look at Jesus, and especially look at the cross. And so if you were to ask, how do I know if my zeal is good or bad? Jesus is the standard. If your zeal, if your passion is making you more like Jesus, then it's good. If your zeal is arousing in you a holy anger towards what is evil, what is life-destroying, but at the same time is arousing in you a greater love for God and a greater love for people, even for your enemies, if it's creating in you a willingness to lay down your life even for your enemies, if it's creating in you things like kindness and goodness and compassion and self-control, if it's creating in you a desire to push through resistance and opposition no matter what the cost for the kingdom of God, those are all things we see in Jesus. And then I would say absolutely your zeal is good. But if your zeal is producing in you envy and bitterness and violence and hatred, you see, Josiah I'm looking at this and there's some violence there, but he's not our standard for zeal. Jesus is. Jesus lays down his life for his enemies. If your zeal is making you more like Jesus, then it's good. Keep going. Be zealous. Be passionate so that you'll become more like him. And I think that raises the last question, the final question I want to address, which is, if zeal is good, if it can be good, and we're instructed to be zealous, and it's what Jesus was for us, then how do we get that zeal? How do we grow in that? How do we get that into ourselves? Well, how would you get a log on fire? How would you set an old log on fire? You got to get it close to the fire. You got to get it in touch with an active flame. That's the only way the thing is going to get set on fire, is if you get it in touch with the fire. You want to have zeal? You want to have passion? You got to get close to the fire. And that means, first of all, getting close to Jesus. If Jesus is the embodiment of zeal in the best way possible, then you got to get close to Jesus. You got to commit yourself to being with him. To spending even extended times in prayer, in reading the Bible, getting to know who Jesus is. And you maybe got to spend, like set aside some decent time for this, to actually be with Jesus, to catch fire. It's not an immediate thing. It takes some time. One of the things that I do, and I think this is a really good thing, I try to do it 3 or 4 times a year and spend like 24 hours. I just go away somewhere. Sometimes I go hang out with monks in mission, and the idea is to get away by yourself. And monks are very socially awkward and very quiet, so it still works even when you're hanging out with monks. To get alone by yourself and just spend this time in prayer, in scripture, reading, and over and over again. When I do that, when I get close to the fire that is Jesus, I find that he restores my zeal. He ministers to me. He speaks to me. I get to know him again. My life finds perspective. I remember what the orientation, what the drive of my life is to be. You got to get close to the fire. And by the way, this might also mean getting some stuff out of your life so there's actually space for Jesus. We talked about this past Tuesday at our Revive Bible study in Acts. We talked about this idea of fasting. And fasting is something that has always happened in church history. Christians have done this for 2,000 years, and the Jews before that, of course, as a spiritual discipline. But we seem to have lost that in the Western world. I know very few people, Christians in the modern West, who commit themselves to fasting, at least for set periods of time. But this practice of fasting, of saying no to food for a period of time, reminds us of our hunger and our thirst for God, and it creates this space in our lives for God to work. And you might have to get rid of some other stuff too. I know for me, when I go, okay, I'm not going on ESPN or TSN this week. I'm taking a week off of sports. I'm not going to know what's happening, and all of a sudden there's space in my mind, in my heart. The things I care about actually are things I should be caring about. It's this creating space, getting some of that junk out of there so that there's actually room for Jesus, getting close to the fire. Listen, you can do this. You can do this. If you want to be zealous like Jesus, you can do this. There are things in your life that don't need to be there. There is space for you to make room for Jesus if you want to. If that's the most important thing in your life, no matter what your life is, you can do it. There is opportunity. You got to get close to the fire. You got to get close to Jesus. And then in a secondary sense, you got to get close to others who are on fire. You got to get close to fires that are already burning. Because so often, I think we kind of look at ourselves and then we compare ourselves to other people. And so we might go, I bet that person, maybe they just pray before meals. Maybe they just have their preset prayer. They probably don't even know what John 3:16 is. Jesus is really lucky to have me on his team. Jesus is really blessed that I'm with him because I pray for a minute a day. So, we compare ourselves to other people. Leonard Ravenhill, the guy who is a fiery man, says, "Are we who still have coals of fire on our altars measuring ourselves by the fireless altars of neighboring churches instead of checking on the praying blaze of our saintly forebears. See, when all around us are, if we surround ourselves with apathetic, lukewarm, cold kinds of people, well then, yeah, we're going to feel okay about ourselves. But when you get in touch with people who are on fire, when I read guys like Leonard Ravenhill or Charles Spurgeon or Robert Murray McShane or Martin Lloyd-Jones or Francis Chan, and I know none of those names probably mean anything to you, but these are the kinds of guys who I'm reading who have that fire. And when I read them, I go, man, I want more. I want more of God. I need more of God. I see the fire in these guys. I want some of that, you know? And I think for Josiah, in his day, if there were people who were hanging around Josiah and they saw his commitment to God, they saw the fire in him for the Lord, they would have wanted some of that. It's infectious. But if in your life, you don't have anybody who inspires you to want more of God, to seek more of Him, you need that. Find those people. Be mentored by them. Get into groups of people. Get into groups of people who are seeking the Lord together. You need to get close to the fire. And so here I come again to the end. Here at the end I come again to the beginning. I come again to the beginning. Why does the world need you? Perhaps especially you of the next generation. Why does the world need you to be zealous? Why is it so important that you be passionate followers of Jesus? It's because of this. It's because the world needs God. The world needs to know who God is. The world needs to know who Jesus is. And this is who God is. He's zealous. He's so zealous that Jesus went through all of that humiliation to the cross for you and for me. If the world is to know who God is, lukewarm, apathetic Christians are not going to get the job done. If the world is to know who God is, then God's people need to represent that same kind of zeal, that same kind of passionate love that others would know Him, would know His salvation. And so this morning, if you are somebody who is not in that place of Christian faith, if that's not you, first of all, again, I just say again and again, I'm so thankful you're here. You are so, so welcome here. And I just want you to know, I want you to know the zeal of God for you. I want you to know the depth of His passion for you, that He laid down His own life so that you would know His love. That's how passionate He is for you. You need to know that. And then for those of you who are in that place of Christian faith, you need to know that being lukewarm, that being apathetic simply is not an option. That if God is God, and if He has done all this for us, then He calls for our lives to be set on fire, to be filled with His zeal and His passion. That's the only way this works. Get close to the fire. Be zealous. Wake up. Let's pray. Invite the worship team up.